On a chokingly hot June night in 1975, an old man with failing kidneys sat on a hard wooden cot in Patna, staring at a single sheet of paper. Outside, loudspeakers were already blaring the news. The Prime Minister had declared a state of emergency. Opposition leaders were being dragged from their beds. Newspapers were silenced. Telephones went dead like snipped nerves. On that piece of paper was a few lines of ink that could, in effect, call an entire nation into open defiance. Jayaprakash Narayan, JP to millions, enemy number one to the government, had hours, maybe less, before soldiers could arrive at his door. His rival, the most powerful politician in India, controlled the police, the army, the press. She had moved first. He sat there, breath shallow, time pounding in his ears like a second heartbeat. Sign, and the country might explode. Hesitate, and the country might slowly suffocate. The old man closed his eyes, and in that darkness he saw not prison bars or crowds, but something very different. A river in flood, a thatched hut on the brink of collapse, and a skinny boy clinging to a tree, watching the world he knew wash away. To understand why that boy would one day dare to challenge a prime minister with almost unlimited power, and why their duel would be fought against a ticking clock, we have to go back to the beginning, to a place that disappears every year. Because Jayaprakash Narayan was born where the land itself refused to stay still. He first opened his eyes on October 11, 1902, in Sitabdiara, a village that isn't one village at all, but a shifting piece of earth. Between the Ganga and the Gandak rivers, on the border of what is now Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Imagine growing up in a place where every monsoon the river redraws the map. One year your house is on the riverbank. Next year that land is gone, swallowed by brown, merciless water. Fields vanish, trees uproot. Cows, boats, sometimes people are carried away in the same silent, unstoppable current. For most children, home means something solid. For young Jayaprakash, home meant something fragile, always at risk of being erased overnight. His father, Harsh Narayan, was a minor official, a clerk in the canal department, with the steady, slightly hunched posture of a man who believed in rules and documents and signatures. His mother, Phul Rani Devi, was the opposite. Warm, emotional, fiercely protective, her faith as unshakable as the river was unpredictable. She would tuck the boy into her arms during storms and whisper prayers almost directly into his bones. Those two forces, the father's belief in orderly systems, the mother's belief in something higher and more just, would tug at Jayaprakash all his life. As a boy, he was quiet, watchful. There's a particular kind of silence in children who learn early that the ground literally cannot be trusted. He learned to read the sky before rain, the river's color before a flood, the adults' voices before bad news. Whenever the river rose in anger, he would stand on the edge, wind whipping his face, and feel something impossible to articulate. Fear, yes, but also a strange fascination. How could something so beautiful be so ruthless? How could forces so huge be allowed to do as they pleased, while small people like his parents just endured? He didn't have the words yet, but the question was there, hissing quietly in the back of his mind. Why is the world arranged like this? When he was still a child, the family moved to Betaya and then to Patna for his education. Leaving Sitabdiara was like tearing a root from wet soil. But Patna was another world altogether. Busy streets, British signboards, stone buildings, and more dangerously, ideas. In school, surrounded by English textbooks and imperial portraits, he saw the routine humiliations of colonial rule. Indian teachers bowing just a little too low to British inspectors. Indian students punished harder for the same mistakes. The Union Jack flying over their heads like a reminder, this is not your house. One afternoon in the dusty school courtyard, someone slipped him a crumpled pamphlet. It had a rough picture of a man with round glasses and a walking stick. Who's this? Jayaprakash asked. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, whispered the boy beside him. They say he made the British shake in Champaran. Champaran. The word hit him like a stone. That was his world. The fields around his river village. The same kind of peasants he knew by name. And this man, this frail figure in the drawing, had made the British afraid? At home that evening, he listened as elders spoke about Gandhi's satyagraha in hushed, reverent tones. About indigo farmers forced into backbreaking contracts, about beatings and starvation, and then, incredibly, about a tiny group of unarmed villagers standing firm as the empire blinked, For the first time, the immovable rules of the world seemed capable of cracking. Still, the official script of his life was already being written. Study hard, pass exams, become a lawyer or an engineer, move up quietly inside the same system that had humiliated his people. He could almost see that future, a safe job in a British office, an obedient signature under foreign laws. But outside the classroom, new winds were rising. By the time he entered Patna College in 1920, India was vibrating with anger. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 had shattered any illusions about the hidden justice of the empire. In his hostel room, behind closed doors, students whispered the names of the dead as if reading a forbidden prayer. Then Gandhi did something unthinkable. He asked thousands of young men like Jayaprakash to walk away from their textbooks. Leave government colleges, the call went out. Leave the institutions that keep us dependent. Come, build a new India. Patna College buzzed like a disturbed beehive. In the corridors, debates exploded. Are you mad? One friend grabbed his arm. You'll throw away your degree? For what, spinning wheels and slogans? Another voice, quieter, far more dangerous, came from within Jayaprakash himself. If you stay, what does that say about you? At home, the conflict turned into open war. His father's face, usually calm, tightened into thin lines. This is madness, Jayaprakash, he said, his voice controlled but trembling. Do you think Gandhi will feed you when you're hungry? Will he care when you can't get a job? His mother watched silently, torn between her husband's fear and her son's fire. That evening alone, Jayaprakash felt time closing in on him. Admissions to Gandhi's new national institutions were happening now. The British college would not take back deserters easily. This wasn't a decision he could postpone for months. It was days, maybe hours. Remain and accept a future of safe servitude. Leap and walk into a fog. Under the dim, flickering lamp, he didn't sleep. He imagined himself 10 years from now sitting behind a desk, stamping files, while others risked jail, bullets, death. He imagined explaining that to his own children one day. When dawn broke, the choice was already made. He walked into Patna College, returned his scholarship, and walked out into uncertainty and into history. He joined the Bihar Vidyapith, the national institution that followed Gandhi's call. No more polished British buildings. Instead, modest rooms, coddy clothes, spinning wheels, lectures under trees. The education was harder, poorer, and infinitely richer. He wasn't just learning anymore. He was preparing. But destiny, like the rivers of his childhood, was not done reshaping his path. Around this time, an idea began to burn in his mind. See the world beyond India. See how other nations lived, worked, fought. Not as a tourist, but as a worker, a student, a nobody. In 1922, driven by a mix of idealism and youthful bravado, he made an audacious decision. He would go to America. Not because he adored the West, but because he wanted to understand its machinery from the inside, to see how industrial power was built, to touch the engines of modernity that Britain used to rule over countries like his. He sold what little he had, borrowed from relatives, and left his family sobbing on the riverbank. His mother, clutching his hand until the last possible second, pressed a small image of a deity into his palm. Remember who you are, she whispered, and come back. The ship ride to America stripped away any remaining illusions of romance. Days of seasickness, the stench of cramped quarters, the strange food, the colder stares of officials in foreign ports. At every checkpoint, he felt his brown skin being weighed and measured. When he finally stepped onto American soil, it was not into a dreamland, but into a country that judged him first by his color, second, by his poverty, and only distantly by his intellect. He reached the University of California, Berkeley, with more hope than money. Fees were high, work was scarce. English was not yet his natural tongue. The letters he wrote home became shorter, less frequent, edged with desperation he tried to hide. To survive, he took whatever work he could find. He picked grapes under a brutal sun in California fields, fingers cracked and sticky with juice. He washed dishes in restaurants where he never sat as a customer. He shoveled snow in winters that stabbed like knives through his thin clothes. In Iowa and Wisconsin, he worked in slaughterhouses, where the metallic smell of blood filled his lungs, and in factories where the whine of machines was so loud it seemed to scrape the inside of his skull. He studied by night, eyes red, falling asleep over books, waking with ink stains on his hands. Sometimes he skipped meals to pay for paper and secondhand textbooks. Loneliness surrounded him like a second atmosphere. But in the libraries and lecture halls of America, something else was happening to him. He met Marx. He met Lenin. He met the raw, systematic language that tried to explain the very forces he had felt wordlessly as a child by the river: exploitation, inequality, power. In study groups and dingy rooms thick with cigarette smoke, he argued about capitalism and class with other students: Russians, Germans, Americans, Chinese. He saw the other side of the American story, not just skyscrapers and cars, but breadlines and broken men wandering the streets after losing everything in the crash of 1929. He watched as the mighty land of opportunity crumpled under a depression almost no one had predicted. Factory owners shut gates, workers slept on sidewalks. Newspapers fluttered with headlines about suicides on Wall Street. The American myth cracked open and he peered into its machinery. He was shocked by the efficiency, appalled by the cruelty, but also fascinated by the potential. If such power could be harnessed not for profit but for people, the boy who had once watched rivers destroy fields now watched invisible economic forces destroy lives, and the question rose again, and a stronger, more urgent: why is the world allowed to be arranged like this? By the time Jayaprakash Narayan completed his studies in sociology, the transformation was undeniable. He had left India as a Gandhian idealist, ready to spin khadi and court arrest. He was returning as something far more dangerous: a socialist with an international vocabulary of revolution. And then America placed one last temptation in his path: a respectable job, a potential academic career, a life where hunger would be a memory, not a daily possibility. In quiet moments, he imagined a small house, a routine, a safe distance from the storms brewing in India. Why go back to a colonized land about to erupt? Why trade comfort for chains, uncertainty, and possibly a noose? Letters from India, however, carried another kind of urgency. Gandhi was launching the civil disobedience movement. Jawaharlal Nehru was being arrested again and again. The British Raj was tightening its fist. Somewhere in Allahabad, a young girl named Indira watched policemen take her father away, clutching the bars of the gate as the car disappeared. She too would learn that the world's arrangement was not unbreakable. The men who shaped her childhood were lawyers, prime ministers, power itself. One day, the man stepping off a ship with Marx in his head and Gandhi in his heart would collide with the woman who grew up inside power's very house. Neither of them knew it yet, but the clock silently had already started ticking. In 1929, JP stepped back onto Indian soil. The air felt thicker. The colors seemed sharper. Or perhaps it was he who had changed. India was a different country than the one he had left. Flags now floated more boldly over marches. Slogans were shouted louder with less fear. Police lothas fell harder. When he traveled to meet Gandhi, the meeting felt almost like a gravitational event. On one side, the global theoretical frameworks he had absorbed in America: class struggle, historical materialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat. On the other, a frail man in a simple dhoti talking about truth, nonviolence, and the spinning wheel. They did not always agree, but Gandhi saw in JP a rare thing: a mind sharpened by Western thought, yet not seduced by Western power. Nehru, too, recognized a kindred spirit: restless, impatient, drawn to socialism, hungry to tear down the feudal and capitalist structures choking India. Late into the night, they would talk about Soviet experiments, about planning, about workers and peasants, about what freedom should actually mean beyond replacing one flag with another. Inside the Indian National Congress, however, not everyone was thrilled by this new firebrand with his foreign-tinted socialism. Senior leaders, comfortable in their lawyers' gowns, cautious, incremental, looked at JP and men like him with narrowed eyes. They wanted Swaraj, yes, but they also wanted order, gradual change, careful negotiation. JP wanted none of that. Mere political freedom, he believed, without social and economic justice would be a cruel joke. The friction was inevitable. In 1932, during the civil disobedience movement, JP courted arrest. The comfortable path he might have taken in America vanished behind him forever as jail doors clanged shut. Inside prison, in the company of other radicals, his ideas hardened. The debate was not whether to fight, but how far they were willing to go. He spoke of strikes, of peasant uprisings, of shattering the economic backbone of British rule. To some Congress elders, he was an asset. To others, a liability. One stormy evening in a cramped cell with rain drumming on the tin roof, someone asked him, half joking, "So, Jayaprakash, are you going to overthrow the British or the Congress first?" He smiled, but his answer was serious. Whichever stands in the way of real freedom. By the time he walked out of prison, thinner, tougher, and more certain than ever, the path ahead was clear in his mind. The nationalist struggle needed a spine of socialism, not polite resolutions, not half-measures. In 1934, along with Acharya Narendra Deva and others, he helped create a new force inside the Congress Socialist Party. It was not a separate party yet, but a party within the party, a red thread woven into the tricolor. From village meetings under banyan trees to heated sessions in smoky city halls, JP began to speak a new language. Not just quit India, but change India. Not just throw out the British, but throw out hunger, feudalism, and fear. In the plains of Bihar, poor peasants listened, eyes wide. In wealthy drawing rooms, landlords frowned. In the homes of Congress leaders, whispers began. Jayaprakash is talented, but he is dangerous. And somewhere in a sprawling bungalow in Allahabad, that same girl, Indira, now a young woman who had tasted prison as a child and watched power up close, followed politics like one might follow the weather. She saw men like JP pushing the Congress leftward, threatening the comfort of the old elites. One day she would inherit that party. One day she would face that man directly. But for now, Jayaprakash Narayan was still only beginning his climb. Not towards office, not towards a prime minister's chair, but towards something far less stable and far more perilous. Towards becoming the conscience of a nation that did not yet know how desperately it would one day need him. At the exact moment when his friends were slipping into starched khadi and preparing to rule a new nation, Jayaprakash Narayan was learning how to disappear. While others rehearsed for ministerial oaths, he was memorizing secret routes, false names, and the feel of prison walls under his fingertips. Power in 1940s India was a staircase everyone was scrambling to climb. JP was the man walking in the opposite direction. After helping give birth to the Congress Socialist Party, he plunged fully into the struggle that was tightening like a noose around the British Raj. Meetings in cramped rooms, whispered plans over smoky lanterns, endless journeys in third-class train compartments packed with workers and peasants. This was his parliament. He spoke the language of landless laborers and textile workers, of men who slept on railway platforms, of women who pawned their last bangle to buy grain. To them he said something dangerously intoxicating. Freedom is not just a flag. It is food, land, dignity. The British heard another message under his words. Trouble. Police reports began to fatten with his name. Narayan Jayaprakash, dangerous agitator, close links with radicals, influence among youth and labor. His speeches were copied, underlined in red pencil. His movements were tracked. But something else was happening in those years, far from the dusty fields of Bihar. In a sprawling house in Allahabad, a young woman watched men like JP from behind half-open doors. Indira. She had seen her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, leave for prison so many times that the iron bars of jail gates were as familiar to her as the carved doorways of Anand Bhavan. She had organized children's processions, shouted, Inquilab Zindabad, until her throat burned, carried secret messages in her school satchel. To her, radicals like JP were part of the great storm that would sweep the British away. She admired them. She also learned something else. The storm always, eventually, needed a captain. In 1942, the storm finally broke. As the Second World War raged, Gandhi decided it was time. No more waiting, no more petitions. In August in Bombay, he rose before a sea of people and uttered words that detonated across the subcontinent. Do or die. Quit India. The British responded with surgical cruelty. Overnight, almost the entire top leadership of the Congress was arrested. Gandhi, Nehru, Patel, scooped up, locked away. The movement, the British believed, would be decapitated before it could move. They had not counted on men like JP. He, too, was arrested and lodged in Hazarabad Central Jail in Bihar, a place of thick stone walls and heavy doors surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. It was meant to crush hope. Instead, it became a laboratory for revolt. In the dimness of the jail barracks, JP and a small group of comrades whispered of something audacious, an escape. Not the petty dash of a frightened prisoner, but a calculated jailbreak to ignite an underground resistance. The plan was almost insane. On a stormy November night in 1942, as rain slashed the prison yard and guards huddled under whatever shelter they could find, a makeshift rope made of knotted bedsheets and blankets was thrown over the high outer wall. Imagine the scene: shadows moving against black stone, wet cloth biting into palms, breath ragged, the rope swaying dangerously above a dark drop. One slip, one shout from a guard, and it would all be over in a flash of gunfire. JP, not a young athletic hero from a film, but a bookish revolutionary with myopic eyes and a stubborn jaw, hauled himself up that wall, every muscle screaming, the monsoon wind punching his face. At the top, for a split second, lightning tore the sky open. If a guard had looked up at that exact moment, he would have seen a thin man, soaked to the bone, frozen against the white burst of light. Then darkness returned. JP dropped to the other side, hit the ground hard, and vanished into the night. By dawn, prisoner Narayan Jayaprakash was no longer a line in a register. He was a ghost. For the next years, as Quit India flickered and flared, JP moved through India's underbelly like a rumor. Secret meetings in village schools, hurried conferences in grain warehouses, coded messages passed in the hollow of a tiffin box. He helped organize sabotage of communication lines, strikes, acts of defiance, meant to show the British that the movement was alive. Even with its head locked away, the British were furious. Warrants described him as extremely dangerous. Rewards were posted. His photograph, grainy and severe, went up in police stations. Indira heard his name in news reports and in her father's conversations. This man, this Jayaprakash, was the embodiment of a certain uncompromising courage. She absorbed the lesson. The masses would follow someone who appeared ready to lose everything. She filed it away, the way only those destined for power do. When the war finally ended and the empire began, reluctantly, to loosen its grip, JP was arrested again. When he walked out of prison for the last time before independence, he was greeted not as an obscure activist, but as a hero of the underground. And now came a temptation more subtle than any British offer. His comrades from the struggle were about to become the rulers of free India. Cabinet lists were being drawn. State governments were being planned. Men who had once been thrown into cells beside him were on the brink of stepping into ministerial bungalows with lawns and peacocks. Conversations began quietly. JP, you must take a place in the new government. The country needs men like you inside power, not shouting from outside. There were suggestions of portfolios, of chief ministerships, of positions that could turn a revolutionary into a statesman overnight. For a boy who had grown up watching his parents tremble at the mention of distant officials, for a man who had eaten cold prison rotis and slept on stone, it was the ultimate turn of the wheel. But he had seen too much of power to trust it. In smoky, late-night meetings, he argued a different line. Political independence was necessary, yes, but it would be meaningless if the new rulers merely managed the old structures with an Indian accent. Landlords would remain, industrialists would thrive. Villages would still be oceans of poverty. The British will go, he told a gathering of workers in Patna. But if we are not careful, their seats will be filled by Indians who behave exactly like them. So when offers came, and they did, he said no. No to ministries. No to comfortable houses in Delhi. No to the intoxicating click of cameras and the rustle of official files bearing his name. Instead, he chose the harder path, to build from outside a socialist force that would keep the new rulers honest or topple them if they betrayed the revolution's promise. In 1948, as the Congress shed its more radical skin and settled into the role of governing party, JP walked away. The Congress Socialist Party severed its umbilical cord and became the Socialist Party of India. Mulberry curtains and brass nameplates on Lutyens Delhi's grand avenues on one side. Dusty party offices with broken chairs and near-empty cash boxes on the other. JP chose the dust. Across the river in Allahabad, Indira watched another drama play out. The country mourned Gandhi's assassination. Her father, now Prime Minister, staggered under the weight of partition, refugees, and rebuilding. She drew closer to the machinery of power, first as a helper, then as a fixer, then as something far more important, her father's. Eyes and ears inside the party. She attended Congress sessions, observed endless committee meetings, watched as idealists slowly learned the habits of office, compromises, factional bargains, quiet deals with businessmen and landlords. She too saw the rot beginning to set in. But unlike JP, she did not walk away. She made a different calculation. Better to seize the machine, master it, bend it to her will. The race between them had begun, though neither would have described it that way. One was building a moral authority outside the system. The other was climbing, step by careful step, inside it. In the first general election of 1952, the Socialist Party fought bravely and was crushed. The Congress, draped in the halo of the freedom struggle, swept the polls. JP had imagined workers and peasants flocking to a clear socialist banner. Instead, they voted for the familiar tricolor. It was a brutal lesson. Night after night, in modest party offices, he and his comrades pored over results, their fingers tracing columns of defeated socialist candidates. The reality was bald. Democratic power, as expressed in ballot boxes, belonged overwhelmingly to the Congress. He could keep fighting in the electoral arena, spending his life counting votes and stitching coalitions, or he could step even further, away into a place where moral pressure might move the system more than legislative arithmetic. In 1954, he made a decision that stunned friends and critics alike. He would leave party politics altogether, not for retirement, not for sulking irrelevance. He turned towards something far more radical in its simplicity, Gandhi's unfinished dream of Sarvodaya, the uplift of all through voluntary transformation rather than state compulsion. He joined Acharya Vinoba Bhava's Bhudan movement, which was walking from village to village, begging landowners to voluntarily gift land to the landless. The image of Jayaprakash Narayan changed. From microphones and city rallies, he moved to barefoot marches through sun-baked fields. From policy resolutions to sitting cross-legged on mud floors, listening to farmers by the light of a kerosene lamp. He slept in huts where the only luxury was a mosquito net with holes. To cynical urban politicians, it looked like he had exiled himself to harmless sainthood. To the landless laborer who received 2 acres because a landlord poured a line of grain on the ground and said, "This is my gift," it did not feel harmless at all. JP would arrive in a village, lean on his walking stick, look the landlord in the eye and say softly but firmly, "If you love this country, begin here, share." Sometimes it worked, often it did not. But slowly a legend began to grow around him. Here was a man who could have been a minister, perhaps even more, and had chosen dusty roads over red beacons. Meanwhile, the clock in Delhi was ticking in a very different rhythm. Jawaharlal Nehru aged in office. Food shortages, corruption scandals, and slow growth gnawed at the romance of freedom. Elections were still won, but with less idealism and more cash. Inside this increasingly creaky machine, Indira climbed. She became, in 1959, president of the Congress, a post once held by giants, now occupied by a woman some dismissed as Nehru's daughter, and others feared as Nehru's shadow. She watched chief ministers squirm, factions bow. She learned which levers moved which parts of the machine. When Nehru died in 1964, the country wept. JP mourned the friend with whom he had once argued late into the night about socialism and freedom. Indira watched something colder, the scramble for succession. Power, once concentrated in her father's hands, suddenly had no clear owner. In 1966, after a brief interlude under Lal Bahadur Shastri, Indira Gandhi emerged, to the astonishment of many, as Prime Minister. The shy girl in the shadows of Anand Bhavan was now the most powerful person in India. JP by then was walking village paths, far from the TV cameras, but he was not blind. He saw what was happening in Delhi with a clarity that frightened him. The Congress, once a broad movement, was becoming machinery centered around a single person. Indira, underestimated at first by the party bosses, moved quickly. She split the Congress in 1969, destroyed the old syndicate, nationalized banks, aligned herself rhetorically with the poor. Garibi Hatao, she declared. Abolish poverty. The slogan blared from posters, radio, and cinema screens. For millions, especially the young and the poor, she seemed like a new kind of leader. Bold, decisive, unafraid to push aside gray-haired men who muttered about procedure. JP watched both the promise and the peril. On one hand, the talk of uplifting the poor sounded like the socialism he had been preaching for decades. On the other, he recognized the shape of something darker, a cult of personality, a gathering impatience with democratic checks and balances. Ironically, both rivals claimed to be fighting for the same people. Their methods could not have been more different. In meetings with his old comrades, JP's tone hardened. He had left party politics, but he had not surrendered his voice. Articles, speeches, private letters began to carry a sharper warning. If corruption and authoritarian habits were not checked now, Indian democracy, still young, still fragile, might not survive another 25 years. This, for him, was the new ticking clock. India was in its political adolescence. Either it would grow into a robust democracy or it would twist into something broken, ruled by fear and sycophancy, and the window to push it towards the right path was closing fast. By the early 1970s, two more clocks began to tick in the background. One was personal. JP's health was failing. Kidney trouble, blood pressure, the inevitable wear of decades spent on hard cots and relentless travel. Doctors warned him, gently at first and then with more urgency, he could not continue like this indefinitely. He was in his 70s. At best, he had a few good years of active work left. The other clock was political. Indira Gandhi, after a crushing victory in the 1971 elections and a triumphant war that led to the creation of Bangladesh, stood at the peak of her power. Her image beamed from posters like a secular goddess. Parliament, courts, state governments, all seemed in the popular imagination to revolve around her. But beneath this apparent solidity, cracks spread. Inflation soared. Jobs vanished. The promise of Garibi Hatao turned sour as prices of basic food items spiked. Corruption scandals reared their heads. A massive railway strike in 1974, led by trade unionists like George Fernandez, paralyzed the country and brought the working class anger into the open. Students, too, were boiling. In Gujarat, protests over rising mess fees snowballed into a statewide movement against corruption. In Bihar, students marched through Patna's streets, shouting slogans not just against their college administrators, but against the entire political class. They needed a face, a moral center, someone whose very name could not easily be dismissed as just another politician. Reluctantly, nervously, their eyes turned to the old man in the khadi kurta, who had spent years walking forgotten village roads. One blazing afternoon in 1974, a small delegation of student leaders arrived at JP's modest house in Patna. They were sunburnt, hoarse from shouting, their eyes glittering with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Babu," one of them said, the word carrying both respect and urgency. "We are being beaten, Lathi-charged, called hooligans. If we continue alone, they will crush us. If you lead us, they will have to listen." JP listened, silent. He had promised himself, and Gandhi's memory, that he would not return to the arena of party politics. He had spent 2 decades telling people that real change began in the village, in the heart, not in the legislature. To jump back into the storm now at this age felt like betrayal of his own journey, of Sarvodaya, perhaps even of the quieter work still unfinished. That night he barely slept. Every cough reminded him of his fragile lungs. Every creak of his bones reminded him of the brutal arithmetic of time. If he stepped into this fight, it would not be for a season. It could be the last battle of his life. He also knew something else. On the other side of this looming confrontation stood not a foreign empire, but a woman he had once admired as a fellow fighter against the British, a woman who now commanded police, intelligence agencies, and a party apparatus woven into every corner of the state. Indira Gandhi was no timid ruler. Cornered, she would not hesitate. In distant Allahabad, another clock ticked. A legal case challenging the validity of her 1971 election. Page by page, affidavit by affidavit, a high court judge in a quiet courtroom was inching towards a verdict that could, in theory, unseat the prime minister. Time for everyone involved was narrowing to a funnel. In Patna, as dawn seeped into his small room, JP finally sat up on his bed. He understood the stakes. If he refused the student's plea, he might preserve his frail health, continue his slow, patient Sarvodaya work, but he would also watch from the sidelines as the democracy he had risked his life to build slid towards something harder, less forgiving. If he accepted, he would be pitting an old man's failing body and a nation's conscience against the full machinery of the state, and against a prime minister who had spent her entire life learning how to wield that machinery. The rivalry that had been half shadow, half respect, would become open confrontation. He had hours before the students would return, eyes hopeful, notebooks ready to record his answer, and before word of his decision, either way, leaked across the whisper network of journalists and party workers to the ears of Delhi, the river of his life once more had reached a point where it had to change course. Jayaprakash Narayan swung his legs off the bed, coughed, and reached for his glasses. The old revolutionary who had escaped prison walls under lightning, who had walked away from the lure of power when everyone else scrambled towards it, now faced a different kind of wall, time itself. Outside, in the dusty streets of Patna, boys in cheap sandals were already gathering, clutching hand-painted placards, chanting his name. Inside, counting his remaining breaths like a man counts the days before monsoon, he prepared his answer, an answer that would, within months, turn a simmering student unrest into a nationwide movement and set him on a direct collision course with the Prime Minister of India. The countdown had truly begun. When a 72-year-old man with failing kidneys whispers yes to a room full of angry students, a government that commands millions of soldiers begins to shake. By the time the young men and women trooped back into his Patna house that day in 1974, sweat-damp shirts sticking to their backs, slogans still echoing in their throats, Jayaprakash Narayan had already crossed the line in his mind. He listened to their reports of Lathi charges, of tear gas in college courtyards, of professors cowering behind office doors while police chased students down stairwells. Then, in that raspy, gentle voice that had calmed prison barracks and stirred railway platforms, he said words that would change the direction of Indian politics. "I will stand with you, but if I come, it will not be for Bihar alone. It will be for the whole country." The room fell silent. They had come for a patron. They had just recruited a general. Within weeks, the scattered protests in Bihar began to harden into something with a name, a shape, a direction. What had started as a student agitation over corruption, exam leaks, hostile conditions, became the Bihar movement, and at its moral center stood a man who, only months before, had been walking from hut to hut preaching quiet village reform. On 5th of June 1974, the transformation became visible. Gandhi Maidan in Patna, a stretch of open ground that had seen processions against the British, now filled with a different kind of crowd. Farmers in dusty dhotis, clerks in sweat-stained shirts, university students in bell-bottoms, women with their saris pulled over their heads to shield against the fierce sun. They came in their tens of thousands, spilling into side streets, climbing on trees and walls for a glimpse. On the makeshift stage sat J.P., thinner than ever, a shawl around his shoulders despite the heat. When he rose, the cheer was strange. Not the frenzied roar reserved for film stars and demagogues, but the deep rolling sound you hear when people are betting the last of their hope on one frail body. He leaned into the microphone, fingers visibly trembling, and dropped a phrase like a match into dry grass. Sampurna Kranti, total revolution. Not a coup, not a call to arms. A revolution that would begin, he said, in the heart and spread to politics, economics, education, culture, the very way power was imagined in India. Corruption, caste tyranny, authoritarianism, economic injustice, all of it, he insisted, had to be uprooted together. Today in Bihar, he told them, tomorrow in all of India. The crowd did not chant, "Long live JP." They answered with a single word, Kranti, 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 revolution. In Delhi, in a high-ceilinged room painted a pale bureaucratic cream, the echoes of that word arrived as a file, a thick folder placed on a polished table. Inside, intelligence reports on the Bihar agitation, names of student leaders, transcripts of JP's speeches, photographs of rallies where his frail frame looked like the eye of a storm. Indira Gandhi studied the file, her face carefully still. She had grown up idolizing men like Jayaprakash, watching them shuffle into prison with nothing in their pockets but conviction. But now she wore the weight of Prime Minister on her shoulders, the responsibility of feeding hundreds of millions, fending off political challengers, and defending the idea that she, however imperfect, represented democratic legitimacy. To her, JP's words sounded like something deeply dangerous, an invitation to the street to overrule the ballot box. He insisted he was only asking for accountability, for the resignation of corrupt state governments, for the cleansing of political life. Her advisors used a different vocabulary: subversion, anarchy, extra-constitutional pressure. In Patna, meanwhile, the movement tightened. Processions snaked through the city, crossing the Ganga Bridge like living rivers. Students blocked roads, shopkeepers downed shutters in sympathy. JP walked at the head of some marches, his pace slow, guarded by rings of young volunteers who formed human walls around him. He set clear limits: no violence. No stones thrown at buses, no looting, no arson. Non-violence is our weapon, he repeated, invoking Gandhi not as a saint in a photo frame, but as a strategist whose methods had broken an empire. Yet each day he also sharpened his critique. He called for the resignation of the Bihar government, not through a coup in the dark, but via pressure from below so intense that the rulers would have no choice but to bow. The people, he said, are above parties. When parties betray them, the people must act. The students adored him. The establishment heard something else, a call that, if it spread, could make every elected government a target of street power. And it did spread. The vibrations from Bihar traveled down telegraph lines and transistor radios to campuses in Delhi, Lucknow, Bangalore. Opposition parties, starved of a figure who could bridge their rival egos, began to scent opportunity. From the socialist left to the Hindu nationalist right, they moved cautiously closer to JP, offering support. It was an alliance his younger self might have rejected. Now, counting his remaining healthy years on one hand, he made a brutal calculation. If democracy itself was at risk, the luxury of ideological purity could wait. He would accept help from anyone willing to commit, at least for this battle, to the defense of civil liberties and constitutional rule. By 1975, the man who had once renounced party politics was addressing rallies where flags of multiple parties fluttered side by side, and where volunteers from organizations he had long mistrusted, including the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, quietly worked to manage crowds and logistics. It was a strange, uneasy coalition. The only glue holding it together was his moral authority and the growing anger against Indira Gandhi's government. That anger in June 1975 found a legal expression that neither side could ignore. In a courtroom in Allahabad, far from the television cameras, Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha read out a verdict on a case that had been crawling through the system for 4 years. Raj Narayan, a defeated candidate, had alleged that Indira Gandhi's 1971 election to the Lok Sabha had been aided by misuse of state machinery. The judge agreed. He found her guilty of electoral malpractice, set aside her election, and barred her from contesting any election for 6 years. In theory, she could remain prime minister while appealing to the Supreme Court. In practice, the political ground shook. Opposition leaders demanded her resignation on moral grounds. JP went further. Speaking to a sea of people, his voice now thinner but his words harder, he said, "A prime minister found guilty of corrupt practices must go. If she will not resign, the people must compel her through nonviolent struggle to step down." The conflict that had simmered as rivalry now flared into open confrontation. Indira, bruised but not broken, rushed to the Supreme Court and obtained a conditional stay. She could continue as prime minister, but not draw salary or vote in parliament until the case was finally decided. To JP, this was legal acrobatics. To her, it was a narrow bridge back from the edge of chaos. The clock, already ticking, began to pound. On one side, an aging revolutionary trying to rally a diverse opposition before his body gave out. On the other, a prime minister convinced that if she yielded now, chaos and perhaps even disintegration of the Union would follow. The decisive moment arrived on a sweltering evening in Delhi, June 25, 1975. Ramlila Maidan, the same ground where freedom fighters had once gathered, now heaved with bodies again. Floodlights bathed the crowds in a harsh artificial day. Loudspeakers crackled, slogans rose in waves. Indira Hatao, "Save democracy!" JP, exhausted from travel and illness, had almost not come. Doctors had pleaded, friends had warned. One more massive rally, one more punishing journey, and something inside him might snap permanently. He came anyway. Leaning on 2 young volunteers, he climbed the steps to the stage, the air thick with dust and expectation. When he began to speak, his voice faltered, then steadied on anger. He called for peaceful civil disobedience against what he now described as a corrupt authoritarian regime. He urged government servants to resist illegal orders. And then, in a line that would be replayed, quoted, and weaponized, he looked up from his text and addressed the men in uniform. "When the government is acting against the people," he said, "it is your duty, in the name of the Constitution, to refuse such orders." To him, it was the purest Gandhian logic, conscience above blind obedience. To Indira and her advisors, listening uneasily to reports from the ground, it sounded like the spark of mutiny. By nightfall, the decision she had been circling for weeks was made. Sometime after midnight, as most of Delhi slept, a small group gathered at her residence on Safdarjung Road. A proclamation lay on a table invoking Article 352 of the Constitution. Internal disturbance, it said, endangered the security of India. She signed. The president signed. Emergency was declared. What followed in those hours unfolded like a coup designed by a lawyer. Telephones went dead in opposition headquarters. Electricity to newspaper presses in Delhi was cut. Police stood in newsrooms reading proofs before the ink could dry, spiking anything even slightly critical. In houses and party offices across the country, doors banged open in the small hours. Leaders were roused from sleep by flashlight beams and arrest warrants under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, a law that allowed detention without trial. The list was long. Socialists, communists, trade unionists, journalists, student leaders, ordinary workers whose only crime had been to shout slogans in the wrong march. Among the first names, Jayaprakash Narayan. He was staying at the Gandhi Peace Foundation in Delhi that night, his body too fragile now for the rough and tumble of student hostels in Patna. Just past midnight, boots sounded in the corridor. A knock, a quiet announcement. "Warrant, sir." He did not fight. The man who had once climbed prison walls in a thunderstorm now shuffled into custody. His spine bowed not in surrender but in sheer physical fatigue. As he stepped into the police van, he looked briefly at the dark, shuttered city. "You can imprison me," he told the officers, almost gently. "You cannot imprison the people's conscience." They took him to Chandigarh. There, in a government hospital turned into a surreal cross between clinic and jail, he was lodged as state prisoner. The doctors who examined him blanched at his charts. Renal failure, high blood pressure, a body worn thin by decades of austerity. Treat him, they were told, but keep him. Outside, the country entered a different season. Censorship turned newspapers into pale, obedient sheets. The words JP movement disappeared from headlines as if erased with acid. Radio, the government's voice, sang praises of discipline and order. Opposition leaders remained behind bars, some for months, some for almost the entire 21 months of emergency. In the shadows, other uglier programs advanced. Under the aggressive zeal of Indira's younger son, Sanjay Gandhi, a campaign of forced sterilization swept through poor neighborhoods. Men were rounded up for vasectomy camps under pressure to meet targets. Some never returned alive. Slums near Delhi's Turkman Gate were bulldozed in the name of beautification, their residents given little warning, less compensation. The official language was crisp and technocratic. Population control, urban planning. On the ground, it felt like the state's boot on the neck of the poorest. From his hospital prison bed in Chandigarh, JP learned of these things in fragments, through censored letters, through the rare fearless reporter, through the whispers of sympathetic staff. He did not see the slum demolitions. He saw something else, his own urine turning red. One night, trying to reach the toilet unaided, he collapsed. The fall damaged his spine. At one point, doctors were not sure he would live through the week. In Delhi, the government faced a nightmare question. What if Jayaprakash Narayan died in custody? The man they had painted as a dangerous anarchist would become, overnight, a martyr of almost mythic proportion. Reluctantly and loudly insisting it was on humanitarian grounds, they shifted him to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and then in late 1976 released him on parole for specialized treatment in Bombay's Jaslock Hospital. He left jail technically a free man. In reality, his body had become its own prison. He could barely stand without support. Dialysis machines hummed beside him. Tubes snaked from his arms. The once tireless walker of villages now measured his journeys in the length between bed and armchair. And yet, even like this, he was dangerous. From that hospital room, amid the smell of antiseptic and the soft squeal of wheels on polished floors, he began to dictate letters. To old comrades, to foreign journalists, to the people of India. They were not fiery manifestos. They were calm, searing accounts of what he believed was being done to the soul of the Republic. The normalization of fear, the training of citizens to whisper, the quiet rewriting of rules to suit rulers. When these letters slipped past censors and found their way into international media, the BBC, foreign newspapers, India's emergency, all which the government had tried to present as a kind of benign internal discipline, was suddenly under a global spotlight. At the same time, something else was happening in the places where so many of JP's old allies now lived: jails. In cells in Patiala, Bangalore, Rohtak, Pune, leaders who had once torn into each other in parliament debates now shared blankets and gossip. Socialists debated with Hindu nationalists. Farmers' leaders argued with urban liberals. Above all these quarrels, like a persistent background hum, was JP's message, smuggled in through lawyers and relatives. Unite. Leave your old party labels outside the door. If we survive this, we must build a single front for democracy. It was a challenge as audacious as anything he had attempted in his youth. Forge, from fragments that distrusted each other, a united political force that could defeat the most powerful Prime Minister India had ever seen, and do it fast, before his kidneys failed forever, before the emergency hardened into permanent rule. Indira Gandhi, meanwhile, believed time was on her side. The trains ran on time, strikes had vanished. Crime statistics, at least on paper, had dipped. The opposition was caged, the press largely muzzled. In opinion surveys conducted by a cowed bureaucracy, support for her seemed solid. Confident, convinced that history would vindicate her as the woman who had disciplined Indian democracy, she made what many still consider the most surprising move of her career. In January 1977, she announced elections. For the first time in 19 months, the people would be handed back their ballots. It was, in effect, a test. Was JP's claim that beneath the silence lay simmering resentment true? Or had the emergency, through fear and order, created a new kind of obedient citizen? In hospital rooms and small party offices, the countdown resumed, faster now. Opposition leaders walked out of jail into a sunlight they had half forgotten, blinking, thin but alive. They moved quickly under the old man's watchful, failing eyes to do what he had begged them to do, merge. Congress, the Bharatiya Lok Dal, the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, fragments of the Socialist Party, all dissolved their identities into a newborn creature, the Janata Party. It had no single towering leader, no consistent ideology, no polished organization. What it did have was a face on the wall above its meetings, a black and white photograph of Jayaprakash Narayan, smiling faintly, eyes magnified behind thick glasses. He refused all offers to contest a seat. He sought no office. He asked for only one thing, that the campaign be fought, not as a vendetta against Indira Gandhi the person, but as a referendum on emergency itself. Let the people, he said, decide whether they want fear or freedom. Doctors warned him against campaigning. He did it anyway as far as his body would allow. In some places, he addressed rallies from a wheelchair. In others, his voice reached through tape recordings played on makeshift speakers in dusty bazaars, the hiss and crackle only adding to the sense that these words had been smuggled through hostile territory. He had, everyone knew, limited time. So did Indira. The election dates were fixed. The country, for the first time, would judge not just parties and promises, but two starkly different ways of imagining power. One, centered on a strong leader and discipline, the other on the messy, often infuriating noise of democracy. On the night the counting began in March 1977, India held its breath. In a quiet room in Bombay, lit by a single lamp, JP lay propped up by pillows. A small transistor radio sat near his hand, its metal warm. Around him were a few close aides, watching his face as announcers read out early trends. In constituency after constituency across North India, a pattern emerged like a slow, relentless drumbeat. Congress, defeated. Janata, elected. Cabinet ministers lost. Power brokers lost. In Raebareli, Indira Gandhi herself fell. In Amethi, Sanjay Gandhi, architect of the sterilization drive, was rejected by the very voters among whom he had once walked, promising a new India. For the first time since independence, the Congress was out of power at the center. The citizen, after 21 months of ordered silence, had whispered in the only way that mattered. Jayaprakash Narayan closed his eyes. For a moment, the sounds of his machines, the beeps, the low thrum of pumps, faded, replaced by something else, the distant roar of crowds, the echo of slogans that had carried his name, the memory of a rainy prison yard where he had once climbed a rope of bedsheets to escape foreign rulers. Now, in the winter of his life, he had helped a nation escape something more insidious, the temptation to trade freedom for the illusion of safety. He had no office to move into, no oath to take, no red beacon to mount on a car. Yet, for one fragile, extraordinary moment, The man who had always walked away from power found the map of Indian politics redrawn along the lines he had sketched in midnight conversations and hospital letters. In Delhi, ministers packed their files into cardboard boxes. In villages, cheap radios crackled with impossible news. And between them, like a thin, flickering line connecting jail cells, slum lanes, college campuses, and cabinet rooms, ran the signature of one stubborn, ailing man who had decided one hot afternoon in Patna that he could not afford the luxury of rest while the clock of democracy was running out. India handed him victory, and then, almost as if to test how much punishment one frail body could bear, began tearing that victory apart in front of his eyes. The morning after the 1977 results, Delhi woke to an unfamiliar sky. No Congress at the center, no Nehru-Gandhi at the apex of power. Cars bearing the tricolor flag now carried men who had spent the last 21 months in prison cells. The gates of Parliament were about to swing open to a government born out of resistance, not dynasty. In a quiet hospital in Bombay, plugged into machines that hummed like distant generators, Jayaprakash Narayan tried to smile. He had not taken an oath, not worn a garland, not stepped on the green carpets of the Lok Sabha. Yet everyone, from jubilant crowds in North India to worried diplomats in Western capitals, used the same phrase for the earthquake that had just shaken the subcontinent. JP's victory. They called him, half in awe, half in mischief, the king without a throne. He heard the phrase and winced. If he was anything, he thought, he was a watchman at the gates of democracy, not a monarch. But even watchmen know that gates, once opened, can swing shut again if the guards start quarreling among themselves. That fear began to gnaw at him almost immediately. As the leaders of the newborn Janata Party flew to Delhi to decide who would become prime minister, JP lay on his hospital bed listening to reports. Morarji Desai, proud ascetic seasoned. Jagjeevan Ram, brilliant Dalit, freshly quit from Indira's government. Charan Singh, lion of the farmers, stubborn as a rock. Each man had fought Indira Gandhi, each had suffered in jail, and each believed in his bones that he deserved the top chair. To the public, it looked like a family of freedom fighters coming home together. To JP, hearing the hissing of oxygen and the low murmur of aides reading out telegrams, it sounded dangerously like old party rivalries putting on new clothes. He moved quickly as a man with needles in his veins could. He sent messages. This is not the time for ego. Choose the leader most likely to hold you together, and remember why the people trusted you. When the dust of backroom bargaining settled and Morarji Desai emerged as prime minister, JP accepted it with the weary grace of a man who knew he no longer had the strength to referee every quarrel. He had won the war against emergency. Now began a different battle, messier, slower, fought not against a single authoritarian rival, but against the habits of Indian politics itself. He had always said, "The people are above parties." Now he watched as the very parties that had taken his name to the streets returned, in slow, almost automatic motions, to the familiar games of faction, patronage, and revenge. From his hospital room he could not stride through ministries, but he could still wield the sharpest weapon he possessed, moral pressure. He summoned ministers, party chiefs, activists. They came, some with tears in their eyes, some with notebooks in their hands, some with a growing sense of irritation they tried to hide. He told them this was their once-in-a-generation chance, not just to replace one government with another, but to actually attempt the total revolution he had thundered about in Patna. To decentralize power, clean up elections, strengthen panchayats, make governments answerable to citizens in real, tangible ways. Do not, he pleaded, become a pale copy of the Congress you defeated. If you repeat their mistakes, the people will punish you more harshly than they punish them. There was another clock now, louder than any political timetable, his own body. Doctors informed him gently but firmly that even with dialysis, his kidneys were failing. Each week they delayed reform was a week sliced out of the little time he had. Between treatments, his skin sallow, his hands sometimes too weak to hold a pen, he dictated letters that read like a race against death. Before I go, let me see at least the beginning of the India we dreamed of. While he wrote, while Janata leaders wrestled over portfolios and policies, another figure was quietly, steadily rebuilding her shattered fortress. Indira Gandhi, once dismissed as politically finished, walked into Parliament now as a simple MP without the armor of office. Her defeat in Raebareli had stripped more than her seat. It had taken the aura of invincibility she had worn since the Bangladesh War. But she was not a woman who stayed broken for long. In villages where people had cheered her fall, she began to draw crowds again, curious at first, then sympathetic as she spoke of instability, of infighting, of a government more interested in settling scores than solving problems. Her rival was technically the Janata Party. In reality, the shadow she still measured herself against was the same tired, dying man who had helped bring her down. The duel between Indira and JP had entered a new phase. She had time, organizational machinery, and the reflexes of a born politician. He had failing organs, a loose coalition he could not fully control, and the thin, terrifying thread of moral authority. Both of them knew one brutal truth. If Janata imploded, history would not remember the details of who sabotaged whom. It would simply say that the grand experiment named after Jayaprakash Narayan had failed. All through 1977 and into 1978, the signs worsened. Janata allies sniped at each other in public. Old RSS cadres and socialists pitched ideological tents inside the same house and tugged at its walls. Charan Singh grew more bitter under Morarji Desai's leadership. Newspapers, now free to write again, gleefully reported every squabble. On his bad days, hooked to machines, JP found himself wondering whether he had unleashed not a new dawn but a new chaos. On his good days, he refused to believe that. He met Morarji, Charan, Jagjivan, each in turn, sometimes together. Photographs from those meetings show a haunting reversal. The younger, healthier men leaning forward, the ancient revolutionary in the middle. His shoulders bowed, his eyes still ferociously alive. "You are not children fighting in a playground," he told them. "You carry the hopes of a nation that showed great courage when it threw off fear. Do not teach them that courage was mistaken." He proposed concrete steps, a common minimum program that focused on civil liberties, land reform, and village empowerment, a voluntary code to limit defections and horse trading, internal democracy inside parties themselves. It was not that they disagreed with his ideals. It was that each man behind the language of principle could hear another drumbeat, the possibility of personal advancement, the old itch for the top chair that power always brings. Meanwhile, Indira Gandhi was listening too. She watched the news of Janata's quarrels with a practiced, almost clinical eye. She reorganized her followers around a new banner, Congress, I for Indira, as much a mark of her ego as a signal of clarity. To voters, the real Congress was back and it had a face. In by-elections, especially in states where Janata leaders appeared most divided, Congress, I, began to do better than anyone in Morarji. Desai's office liked to admit the tide that had once swept her from office was slowly, faintly, starting to reverse. JP's window of time narrowed. By 1979, the betrayal he had dreaded started to play out in real time. Charan Singh, who had never accepted Morarji's authority in his bones, broke away with a faction of Janata. Accusations of corruption and double-dealing flew across microphones. The government tottered. Each time the crisis deepened, leaders turned to JP's name as if it were a kind of magical incantation. Out of respect for Jayaprakashji, we must unite. Lest we insult JP's sacrifices, we must not break the party. They spoke his name. They did not obey his counsel. In his small house in Patna, where he stayed when doctors allowed him to leave Bombay, he listened to radio bulletins with the same sinking feeling he had once known as a young revolutionary in Lahore jail, hearing that his comrades had cracked under interrogation. Only this time the torture was administered not by foreign rulers but by ambition. In the summer of 1979, the Janata government finally collapsed. Morarji resigned. Charan Singh, with outside support from Indira Gandhi, walked into Rashtrapati Bhavan to be sworn in as Prime Minister. Another twist. In the power game that would have been deliciously ironic if the stakes had not been so high. Here was a man who had campaigned against the emergency, now leaning on its architect to sit in the very chair she had once refused to leave. Here was Indira Gandhi, publicly humbled 2 years earlier, now in the position of kingmaker. And somewhere in between, rapidly running out of breath, lay the man who had urged them all to put country before self. When JP heard of Charan Singh's swearing in with Indira's support, he is said to have turned his face to the wall and wept. For perhaps the first time in his public life, he let despair show. All the compromises he had made, joining hands with ideological opponents, pushing his body past its limits. becoming the symbolic center of a movement he knew could turn against him, seemed in that moment to have been for nothing. He had defeated a personal rival, but he had not yet secured the future of the democracy he loved. And the clock, the cruel, indifferent clock in his bloodstream, refused to stop. Charan Singh's government lasted just weeks. Indira Gandhi withdrew her support before he could even face Parliament, forcing yet another election. The country would return to the polls in early 1980, 5 years after the emergency, 3 years after its repudiation, 2 years after the JP wave had swept the north. Jayaprakash Narayan would not live to see that vote. By late 1979, his condition had worsened dramatically. Infection stalked his weakened body. His legs swelled. Breathing became a labor. Doctors urged quiet, rest, isolation from politics. Politics refused to leave his bedside. Visitors came in a stream, old socialists with tears in their eyes, young activists who had first chanted his name as students, ministers, who owed their careers to his moral endorsement. Some came to seek blessings. Some came to unburden their guilt. In those last months, he spoke less of past battles and more of something that had obsessed him long before the word emergency had entered India's political vocabulary: the village. He reminded anyone who would listen that his dream had never been about swapping rulers in Delhi. It had been about remaking the relationship between ruler and ruled from the bottom up. Strong panchayats, transparent administration, citizens who did not wait for a hero to arrive before they raised their voices. If you are waiting for another JP, he told one group of students quietly, you have misunderstood everything I stood for. The point is not to find another man. The point is for each of you to take as much responsibility as you can bear. He was 77. His kidneys were almost gone. He had less than a year, perhaps months. A deadline can focus a mind. His had been focused since the day he first smuggled a letter out of a British jail. But now, at the edge of life, that focus turned almost painfully inward. He dictated his last major appeals to the nation in a voice that often broke mid-sentence. He warned that the return of authoritarian habits could come wrapped next time, not in the blunt language of emergency, but in softer words: stability, progress, national security. He called on the younger generation not to romanticize him, but to study his mistakes as honestly as they studied his courage. On 8 October 1979 in Patna, Jayaprakash Narayan's body finally did what governments and jails and illness had failed to do for nearly 8 decades. It let go. News of his death moved through India not in a single explosive burst, but in a shuddering wave. In the alleys of Patna, men and women who had once walked in his processions lit small lamps on doorsteps. In Delhi, Parliament stood in silence for a man who had never sought a seat in it. In Kashmir, Kerala, Gujarat, distant from his Bihar base, editorials tried to fit the contradictions of his life into tidy columns and failed. He had been a Marxist who turned Gandhian, a party builder who renounced parties, a man who could have been prime minister in the 1950s, who instead chose to disappear into villages and prisons and finally onto the streets again when democracy itself was in danger. His great rival Indira Gandhi sent condolences. She did not yet know that within months she would sweep back to power in the 1980 election, riding a tide of disillusionment with the very Janata rulers who had invoked JP's name as their birth certificate. The irony was brutal. The man who had rallied a nation to defeat authoritarian rule did not live to see that same nation, exhausted and bewildered, recall his old rival to office. His last view of Indian politics was not of triumph, but of fracture. And yet history is not written solely in election tallies. In the decades after his death, his shadow continued to fall in unexpected places. The students who had once climbed rooftops to hear him in 1974 grew into men who would dominate Indian politics in the 1990s and 2000s. Lalu Prasad Yadav, Nitish Kumar, Ramvilas Paswan. They quarreled, they betrayed his ideals in some ways, honored them in others, but all of them built their early authority on a single credential: we were with JP. In Bihar, an airport would bear his name, so would parks, institutes, scholarships. In 1999, 2 decades after his body was laid on a riverbank pyre, the government of India conferred on him the Bharat Ratna, the country's highest civilian honor. The medal arrived too late for the man, but not for the story. It was an official admission that this frail, stubborn figure with no constituency and no office had altered the trajectory of the republic. More importantly, his ideas kept resurfacing. Each time a government grew too arrogant, too insulated from public anger, journalists and activists reached, almost instinctively, for his words about the people above parties. When, in 2011, a fresh wave of anti-corruption protests swept Indian streets around an elderly Gandhian in a white cap, television anchors reached for old black-and-white footage of another thin old man addressing crowds under a harsh sun. They called that movement a new JP moment. It was too easy a comparison, and in some ways an unfair one. There would never be another Jayaprakash Narayan, because the conditions that produced him, the trauma of colonial rule, the moral whirlwind of Gandhi, the hopes and disappointments of the first decades of independence, were unique. But the conflict that had defined his last years, the duel between state power and popular conscience, refused to die with him. Every time a student raises a placard and quotes the Constitution at the police, every time a judge insists that civil liberties are not a luxury to be suspended for convenience, every time a citizen alone in a government office refuses to pay a bribe and instead files a complaint, in each of those small, stubborn acts, the clock that haunted his last days ticks a little more slowly. He had warned that democracy is not a monument you build once. It is a habit you must practice, a muscle you must exercise, or it atrophies. His own muscle, the one that had hauled him up prison walls and through endless railway journeys, finally failed. The kidneys gave out. The heart stopped. But in the map of modern India, there is a faint, persistent line that runs from a village-born boy in 1902 through the fire of independence, through the bleak nights of emergency, to every citizen who has ever looked at a powerful ruler and said, without violence but without fear, "No, you may govern, you may not own us." That line is the life of Jayaprakash Narayan, a man who never held office, who died thinking he had lost the last round to his great rival, and who nevertheless left behind a question that will haunt every government that ever tries to trade freedom for order. When time is running out and power is gathering in, fewer and fewer hands, which side are you on? The comfort of obedience or the dangerous, exhilarating risk of being free?